Screen.
Hi, everyone.
Can
So thank you very much for joining us for this Toronto Data Workshop. This week we actually present really great value for money to you because we have not one presenter, but two actually, a special guest. So we have Ciara and Kaushar. They're both PhD candidates at the University of Toronto, and they're going to be talking about government data and AI strategies. So thank you very much for joining us, Ciara and Kaushar.
Amazing. All right. Uh, Thank you so much. As you said, I'm Ciara with Kaushar, also a McMaster grad, by the way. We're going to be presenting on our work that we did along with our co-author Ryan on work exploring intersections between AI and data policies in Canadian government context. So hopefully, if you have any interest in data governance or data in governance, you'll find something interesting here. Just to start off with a little bit of background, kind of our motivations for starting to dig into this subject. In recent years, governments all over the world have started to demonstrate this increased acknowledgement of and focus on generating policies, strategies, directives, laws all around data. We can see out of the EU, GDPR in 2018. Another one we see cited a lot as fairly exemplary is the California Consumer Privacy Act in 2020. A little bit more recently, a little bit less well developed, but certainly with this new public interest following the launch of tools like ChatGPT or Copilot, we can also see AI policy as a growing area. We've got dedicated AI legislation coming out of the EU, different frameworks being made public from different governments. So we have these two rapidly growing policy spaces, data and AI, that I think we can intuitively understand as being quite interconnected, at least conceptually. And this link of data to AI, it bears out when we start to look at some empirical work from throughout the information fields and data studies and the news media itself. So the first direction of that relationship of data as something that can affect AI is, I think, a little bit more widely known and understood by this point. We know that the outputs of AI models are shaped by the data on which they're trained. We know that these outputs can perpetuate biases or omissions from that training data. Countless examples of this, famous cases, racial bias in facial recognition, image classification or labeling in these sexist, highly gendered ways. But we also see this influence in some more seemingly innocuous ways, like training models on data that are non-representative of the populations that these models are later used to categorize or analyze in different ways. The somewhat less obvious, maybe newer side to consider is the opposite direction, the influence of AI on data. Now, the most extreme version of this is in the form of synthetic or wholly AI-generated data, including things like deepfakes by malicious actors, but also some comparatively benign and widespread things, AI-generated articles and images, people using LLM tools, again, like ChatGPT, to help them author an email or author these other documents that are later compiled into training data sets. And again, this takes other forms as well. Even if generative AI tools aren't being used to specifically make the data, other kinds of AI tools are increasingly being used to process, to label, and to categorize data. So kind of our big background takeaways here. Firstly, there are data policies and there are AI policies being produced and passed at scale all over the world at this increasing pace. Secondly, we know that data and AI have this very well-established mutual influence on each other. These things led my co-authors and myself to our guiding question for this ongoing work that we've been doing, where we're wondering, is this established mutual influence between data and AI actually being reflected in the policies governing these things? Are these policies in conversation with one another, and to what extent, if so? So today we're going to be walking through two distinct pieces of this research. The first was our kind of proof of concept or pilot study where we explored just two kind of cornerstone documents at the federal government level. This work was peer-reviewed, presented at last year's ASIST conference, and it is published in the proceedings linked here if anyone would like to take a look. I can share the slides after. Next is the bigger component. We did an expanded comparative study where we looked at a much broader constellation of different AI and data policy tools, not just from the federal government, but also at the provincial and municipal government levels. This work is about to be submitted, but hasn't yet been peer-reviewed, so you can consider those to be preliminary results. Just a little bit more context on the setting or the backdrop for this work before we get into the exciting stuff. Firstly, here we're focusing on data and AI policies in Canada. We did this for a couple of reasons, not least of which that we are from here. Firstly, it is a governance structure that can plausibly and without too much of a stretch be compared to the US and Europe, while being comparatively understudied relative to those jurisdictions. We also focused on Quebec and Montreal as our provincial and our city level settings because of Montreal's well-established role as an AI hub, and because of Montreal as a place where a lot of early, and as we'll see, very influential AI governance work came from. As a team, we also have some professional familiarity here. Myself and our other co-author, Ryan, have worked as data scientists in the Canadian federal government. So we have that kind of prior engagement with data and AI governance at the working level. Of course, with that said, none of the documents or the policies that we're reviewing here are anything that we contributed to in our professional capacities. All of them are available publicly online, and our conclusions that we reach and that we're going to talk about today are almost certainly not those of any of the governments that we're going to mention. So to start off, let's get into the results of our pilot study. So for this first stage, as I mentioned, we honed in on these two kind of very centralized, targeted policy documents at the federal government level, the data strategy and the AI strategy. Both of these serve basically as the roadmaps. They determine the priorities, the responsibilities for data and AI respectively, for every organization or ministry within the federal public service. Again, this is at the Canadian national level. To explore our question, we took a mixed and multi-method approach to policy document analysis. So on the quantitative side of things, we went through this suite of different text analysis approaches. We looked at term frequency, so what kinds of words, pairs of words, and triplets are being used in these policy docs and how often are they occurring. We also looked at these words in context and compared that. So not just are these two policies both using the word data, but are they talking about data in the same way? Again, in support of that, we explored some unstructured topic modeling. Basically for LDA, which is latent Dirichlet allocation, this bag of words approach, it treats documents as just that, a bag of words. It identifies clusters, so what words tend to co-occur across both documents, and how do those inform our distinct topics. For a topic, it's doing a similar kind of grouping, but it considers more context in assigning scores to each word. So it's looking at the word meaning, where the word is in a sentence, and then from that, it is doing that similar kind of clustering work. Basically, LDA is probabilistic, our topic is incorporating some more semantic meaning. Now, to sanity check those quant results and understand these policies in a little bit more depth, we conducted qualitative thematic analysis. So we went through and kind of in an iterative conversational way, we explored motifs, beliefs, agendas as they were occurring in both policies and pulled out the themes that seemed to reoccur there. In doing this qualitative work, our theoretical lens that we used was that of socio-technical imaginaries, which broadly speaking is this idea that the way that we're describing concepts like AI and data in these policies, in these official texts, it shapes and it kind of influences the scope of possibility in future work and practice. So we'll start our overview of findings nice and simple, just by looking strictly at the words being used in these two cornerstone documents. You can see the top 10 most used words in the AI and data strategies respectively, left and right. Highlighted in red are any of those words that made the top 10 for both documents. Nothing particularly surprising there, especially given the kind of standardized language that tends to be used in these documents. But digging a little bit more into the two strategies, we see that they're citing some similar legal precedents. They're using similar words with a pretty high lexical similarity score as well. But a key thing that we flagged here was that despite that high lexical similarity, there was a very low semantic similarity. So the way that the words were being used tended to differ between the policies. And we can see some of this idea through the unstructured topic modeling work, where we saw 3 different topics that we can broadly understand as being about data and associated tools, AI and associated tools, and governance instruments and kind of goals more broadly. As we might have expected, the AI strategy is mostly about the AI topic, same for the data strategy with the data topic. Both of them touch a little bit on governance in general, but what is very interesting here was that the data strategy didn't mention AI at all. So our initial thought here was, obviously the data strategy doesn't cite the AI strategy because it wasn't published yet, but it's not just that the specific strategy isn't cited, there is no mention of AI whatsoever in the data strategy. And this is something very concerning because we can learn by reading the AI strategy that it describes these ongoing lighthouse projects. So these projects were already in place by the time the data strategy was published. And in these projects, government organizations are using AI-driven language tools to generate translations and summaries of internal data and sets of documents. So clearly AI tools are already affecting the data holdings of the government of Canada, and the primary data strategy document doesn't plan for, regulate, or even mention this reality. We're left to conclude that this mutually influential relationship that we know exists between data and AI in these two cornerstone documents is not being adequately represented. Beyond that, we kind of found a lack of synchronicity between these documents on the level of implementation. So the data strategy is very, very clear in identifying these are the many ongoing major unresolved issues with the current data holdings and data infrastructure of the Government of Canada. They also lay out strategies by which they want to address these issues. And this is a really good thing, right? They're acknowledging that there are these problems with how they've been working with data so far and suggesting ways to address these problems. It's also a little bit concerning when we consider it alongside the AI strategy, which as one of its stated priorities mandates a think AI approach. So it instructs departments to, quote, consider AI options before defaulting to traditional IT or HR approaches. So in other words, the data strategy is saying, here are all of these major issues with our data holdings that we really need to address. The AI strategy says, use these bad data to pursue AI-first solutions. The implications here, what this means for the kinds of AI tools that could be produced from these data, not so much in line with the Government of Canada's broader directives and obligations for responsible ethical service delivery to the public. We've seen repeatedly in the data studies literature the consequences of using majorly flawed data like this to train AI systems. And we've also seen how vulnerable or already marginalized communities tend to face the worst of those consequences. But again, these initial impressions are just at the federal level and just for those two kind of cornerstone data and AI documents. Our next step was we wanted to see, does this trend bear out over a larger corpus of relevant policy documents? And do we witness any kind of coherent AI and data governance strategy across different levels of government? So before I turn it over to Kaushar, just to give a little brief methods update notation, for this next stage of research, we looked at a much bigger corpus of 20 policy documents directly related to data and AI and digital information. We looked at the Government of Canada, the Government of Quebec, and the City of Montreal. So two of the municipal documents from this corpus were only available in French and were part of much larger, kind of more extensive documents that discussed non-related topics. So we considered those relevant sections qualitatively, but not quantitatively. For this updated work, we use the same mixed methods approaches that we did for the pilot study, so qualitative thematic analysis, quantitative text analysis. We also did some network analysis to explore whether these documents were directly referencing each other. So across topics like data policies referencing AI policies, but also across jurisdiction. So like federal documents referencing provincial or vice versa. And then where our previous topic modeling was all completely unstructured, so it looked at the documents and made those clusters of co-occurring words, here we added a new component of doing deductive rather than inductive topic modeling. So after we elicited our themes qualitatively, we searched through the documents to explore quantitatively how these themes and the associated kinds of language were being used. Now I'll turn it over to Kaushar to discuss what we found.
Awesome. Thank you, Ciara. So moving on to our findings, what you see on the slide here is a network diagram that's part of our document level analysis. So it shows our results at the document level. The colors are used to differentiate the three jurisdictional levels. So you can see blue for federal, red for provincial, and then yellow for municipal. And then the shapes indicate the topic of focus. So the circles are for AI, squares for the data, and the diamonds for the information. So from this network diagram, we've extrapolated several key observations. So with the three groupings by color, or in other words, the things that you see by jurisdiction, they suggest references to other policies from the same jurisdiction as being more common. So to be more specific, documents were 44 times as more likely to reference other documents from the same jurisdiction than other jurisdictions. And then we see a similar trend in topic references, which means that documents of the same primary topic, so AI, data, or information, are more likely to reference other documents of that same topic rather than reference each other. And then besides looking at these kinds of citations between different documents, we also looked at centrality. So we wanted to see what some key documents were, and we found two major ones. So the first one was the Montreal Declaration, which was critical for data AI integration strategies for Quebec and Montreal, so not data, but AI. And then provincial municipal, as well as the policy on service and digital, which does considerable work bringing together AI and data policy at the federal level. Now, besides looking at the document level analysis, we also looked at the text level analysis. So the document level analysis really focused on direct citations between policy documents by jurisdiction and by topic. And then here with our text level analysis, what we were concerned with were whether there were meaningful similarities in the contents of these documents. So like the document level analysis, we found that there was a lot of limited crossover when we were comparing jurisdictions, that we found greater alignment between the federal and provincial policies than the federal and municipal ones or the provincial and municipal ones. We also found that generative AI tends to be a focus across jurisdictions, and the technology, generative AI, tends to be discussed very similarly. You can see this on the slide where we've highlighted excerpts from the Federal Guide on the Use of Generative AI, and then the Quebec documentation, the Bonne pratique pour l'utilisation for generative AI from the Quebec government. And here they're both describing the risks associated with AI using very similar language. So here it talks about hallucinations. And then finally, we found that the language being used in data and AI policies diverges at all government levels. So Ciara really pointed out earlier that data and AI are mutually influential and they share impacts. They have comparable implications for privacy, security, surveillance, thinking about open government and supporting the public interest. Yet, what we see in these policies is even the language for AI and data governance, even after a pilot study, is that there's this divergence at the lexical as well as at the semantic level. Now that we've looked at the textual analysis and the document analysis from a quantitative perspective, this is the qualitative analysis. So here we did thematic analysis, and this was to further contextualize our quantitative findings. So what's of interest here, or what we highlight, is that the documents tend to group marginalized communities together, discussing impacts in very similar terms. There's an example on the slide from the data strategy for the Federal Public Service. They also really frequently mention the importance of consulting these different groups, but often framing these consultations as a duty, but the details of these consultations are a lot less apparent. And then besides this theme on the impact of communities, we surfaced several other themes. So here, besides community impact, there was a strong focus on the financial dimension of AI and data policy. So speaking to the government's economic rationale and the prioritization of commercialization. Other themes really focused on how to categorize and group data in AI. So where there was an emphasis on categorizing AI by domains, for instance, healthcare, thinking about education. And then there was the categorization of generative AI and then other forms of AI. So other forms of AI tended to be grouped together. There is also a focus, as expected, on terminology with things like inclusion and the importance of transparency and potential risks. So based on these results and our findings, what does this mean and what does this mean for us in thinking about practice? So as part of our discussion, we considered the discourses similar to the socio-technical imaginaries that Ciara mentioned, so the narratives that are surrounding AI development, deployment, management, and regulation in the government sphere. And we find that there is this emphasis on implementing and innovating with AI, and more specifically, generative AI. And this really aligns with the push for generative AI in the public sector across jurisdictions and speaks to the public visibility of this particular form of AI, as well as its legibility compared to other forms of artificial intelligence. There's also this underlying narrative that AI deployment is inherent progress and inevitable. And there are many critical AI studies that are countering this narrative. So they're claiming that it prevents more purposeful and intentional use and deployment of AI. And then in terms of our narratives, they're concerned with data. So they primarily concentrate on how data, and most often big data, supports decision making and the importance of using this data as evidence. So data here is often portrayed as being more factual or a knowledge source that's given increasing priority in the decision-making process. And it's also deemed to be foundational for digital government. So government that is presumed to be more efficient, more transparent, more responsive, as well as more accessible. And when we're looking at the jurisdictional level and the differences in discourses between jurisdictions, we find that municipalities tend to be more conservative and cautious when they're discussing AI and data. And as well, we see these different references, and there are more frequent references to jurisdictions outside Canada by these municipal as well as provincial governments. And there's an example on the slide there. Now, besides discourses, we also want to think about, in actuality, what's happening. So the reality that comes through these documents is that these documents themselves are very limited in terms of whether or not they're legally binding, and it may be because of the economic logics of the private companies that manage and deploy these technologies. as well as this increasing ubiquity of AI and data technologies that makes regulation so difficult. And as we mentioned earlier, there's also this limited overlap between AI and data policies, given the fact that they are codependent and that they are co-constituted, as indicated in academic articles, in our pilot study, and this current study, like what we see on the slide. We would presume that there would be more shared discussions between AI and data experts, professionals, policymakers, and we'd emphasize that this would be beneficial. And we also find that AI and data policies tend to be more wide sweeping, or more general. And this makes sense as they're trying to capture technologies that are really rapidly evolving. However, community specific descriptions may be more useful for enacting and carrying out the actual policy mandates. So this brings us to our recommendations. We suggest that government policies reflect more closely the relationship between AI and data at all levels of government, so across jurisdictions. We also suggest increasing the enforceability of AI and data policies, and if they are to be left as recommendations, including more shared guidance for government workers to implement these policies. And our policy document analysis also shows that the Canadian government recognizes international policies and makes reference to them as with other levels of government. So for instance, as we mentioned earlier, provincial and municipal documents tend to reference jurisdictions outside Canada rather than the Canadian federal policy document. We recommend speaking in addition to jurisdictions outside, ensuring internal consistency in conversation among the 3 different jurisdictional levels. And then there are also references to communities who should be consulted, and this can be achieved through more community-driven policies, which may also be more actionable based on analysis of policies at the municipal level. So this brings us finally to our limitations as well as future work. So we do recognize that our work is limited by its methodology, by the data corpus, and our analytical approach. So we limited our search of documents to those focused on AI data and information. In future work, we plan to expand these terms further and nuance them, so applying a more domain-specific approach, thinking about these terms within perhaps a more research-intensive sector, for instance, so thinking about healthcare. We also use document analysis, though we do note that in future work, we can strengthen this by triangulating our insights with discussions with government workers as well as policymakers, and this may produce more actionable research that can also be more community-centric. And we also note that quantitative analysis can reduce the complexity of our results, and this is why we do choose to include the qualitative analysis, but we do hope with the insights from workers, we can contextualize those findings further. And this ultimately brings us to the end of our presentation. This research is supported by the Data Sciences Institute, which we're incredibly grateful for, and we really appreciate you all listening, and we're very open to hearing any questions, inquiries that you may have. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Ciara and Kaushar. If folks have questions, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. Maybe while folks are thinking about it, is there a temporal aspect to, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about a temporal aspect and whether you see sort of ChatGPT comes out, I think, what, end of 2022 or so, and then all of a sudden there's more, or that wasn't a watershed moment in your data set?
I think so we didn't do like a detailed temporal analysis here, but I think in general, my observation is that data and kind of digital information, digital transformation policies were certainly happening before that. Post ChatGPT and so on is when the AI specific policies started coming out. So I think prior to this like mass public awareness of this technology, there maybe wasn't as much pressure or need for these like very specific policies. And it was after that point where we started seeing guidance for AI and specifically for generative AI tools and their usage in government.
Are there any questions from folks? If you raise your hand and then I can call on you. Raj?
Okay, can you hear me? Roger Jattle, IBM CTO. Thank you very much for taking the time to present. Can you go back to the recommendation slide for a minute? So fully aligned with the first point you have here, based on experience, observations, and being in a seat where I can closely see what is happening in the federal government. So thank you for highlighting that. The question I have is similar to what Rohan asked. Are there any observations prior to the 2021 mad rush on generative AI? This has to be applicable to things like machine learning, deep learning as well, in addition to the new buzzword of generative AI.
I'll take this one, but Kaushar, interrupt me if.
Okay, I'll go after you, Ciara.
Yeah. From my view of it, I think in general, speaking to what you said about that rush with generative AI, in general, generative AI really, really dominates what policy work there is on AI, whether that's because of the public interest, I'm not sure, but in general, other kinds of AI are less well represented, and where they are represented in much less like specificity and detailed guidelines. So that would be my observation there. But Kaushar.
Yeah, I think
Is that across all governments, or because I can only tell what's happening in the federal government?
From my observation, I would say yes.
Yeah, I think the other major is that it was harder to find things that were more comprehensive or at the level where they were more centralized before 2022. I think it was November 2022 when ChatGPT was publicly released. So I think anything we had before was more working group related papers than the actual policy documents that Ciara, Ryan, and I analyzed.
Interesting. I actually lead the AI working group for SIFT. One last question before I can, leave the stage. So you talk a lot about the reflection of relationship between AI and data. I have not seen you use the words compliance or governance anywhere, or maybe I missed it. Is there any particular reason for why your observations or recommendation doesn't talk about that?
Sorry. So, sorry, Kaushar, go ahead.
No. We can clarify first.
I was just going to ask, so in general, the policies that we're talking about are to do with governance of data or of AI. I think in terms of compliance specifically, there's not a lot of dedicated legislation to that point about like enforceability. A lot of the legislative kind of compliance rules that they cite are from the Privacy Act or from other kind of more well-established areas of work. There's not a ton of like specific AI compliance in legally binding ways, I would say.
True. Compliance is a true word. Yes, I understand. But there's a lot of documents in federal government policy that actually talks to AI from a compliance perspective. And again, used in a small c compliance, not from a legally binding perspective. And there's also, if you look at the policies from the Treasury Board, you will see a lot of conversation around governance. I was just wondering why that did not come up in your presentation.
I think it would be an interesting extension as well. I think even thinking about internal documents that we didn't have access to, I'm sure there's internal compliance, policy documentation, as well as references to things like what we can find, like PIPEDA, what Ciara was saying with existing legislation. So I think that's a great thinking about extension to this work. Thank you.
If anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, but we'll go to Ilya for now.
Thank you guys for the work in the presentation. This was awesome. So I deal with data at a municipal level in Toronto a fair bit, and just like talking to folks across divisions about like opening up data and the way they work with their data. I was curious about the bullet point you had about municipalities generally being more cautious and conservative with their, I guess, like both like data and AI policy. Could you go a little bit deeper into that, and in your reading, what some reasons for that might be, or like what you have observed? Just like very curious what you found.
Actually, do you want to take this one and then I'll jump in after if needed?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, so I think so we looked at Montreal, Quebec, and Canada.
Mhm.
We found that it tended to be more specific. We think it might be because they are working more directly with those local communities, but also the comparative overlap. So we talked about the fact that there weren't as many references between the municipal government to the federal level documentation. So
Mhm.
we think that there's also some element of there's more autonomy with the municipal government making or implementing some of their own decisions or choices around AI governance policies. So they're consulting other sources. So I would say, Kira, if there's anything you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, I guess the form of what that increased caution looked like is, in contrast, we mentioned the think AI and AI first kind of mentality,
Mhm.
especially in those two cornerstone documents at the federal level. In the municipal documents, again, just for Montreal, but maybe a broader trend, we saw a lot more dedication of page space and words to caution and risks, and here are the potential consequences and potential harms to different communities, and just a lot more detail. So that's kind of uh, the form of the documents that led us to that conclusion, if that helps.
And then adding a bit to that is that also the focus on some of the federal documentation was this idea of like commercialization, innovation, research. And because it's such a contentious issue in terms of innovation on the global stage, there was also that positioning of where does Canada fall in terms of innovation in AI, data technology that we saw a lot less of at the municipal level. So there isn't that same sort of prioritization of perception or like the geopolitical part of this.
Got it. Thank you guys so much.
John?
Thanks, everyone, and thank you very much. I'm John from the Digital Society Lab at McMaster University. I have a bit of an out-of-scope question that builds off your last bullet here about community-driven policies. So in these kinds of cases, I often wonder about the sort of the trade-off between like representativeness and interest when it comes to participation in consultations, or between representativeness and like knowledge. And I imagine that kind of trade-off might be sharper in this space than in maybe some other policy domains where an individual's experience kind of equips them with interest or knowledge that allows them to participate. So I'm always on the lookout for good examples of consultations or community-driven sort of policy development, or even bad examples, best practices, really bad practices. So it's just sort of your thoughts about what you've encountered in terms of what seems to work, what seems to not work in terms of these community-driven policy developments in this space.
I could go with an example from my specific experience and conversations, but the one that really stands out to me as both what works and what doesn't work is we showed that list of like, it is obligated to consult with lists of communities and peoples here. That, from my view, is not a very productive thing because it's treating all of these communities as like, yes, let's check the box and get the community insights. Whereas in particular, one of the communities on that list, they were talking about Indigenous Canadians, kind of slotting communities in as a checklist. Well, there are these kind of ongoing movements and underway projects for like Indigenous data sovereignty and kind of OCAP principles and their own control over their own data. That to me is an example of, rather than just, check a box, get feedback, and continue with our existing system, to me, for that to be more effective, you should be consulting with these community projects and understanding, okay, these infrastructures are already being made and being put in place. How can we work with them without absorbing or incorporating entirely into our work? So that to me, like the ongoing Indigenous data sovereignty projects, I know out west, again, I'm thinking from the community groups that I particularly work with, but the Cascadena communities are working on their own internal kind of data servers and building their own AI tools based on those. So to me, more support for those community-driven kind of practical projects is what's helpful here, not ask the communities to check off on a list for our existing data.
And then adding to Kira's point, some other examples I can think of is sometimes there'll be partnerships between research institutions and certain groups. So I think it's called Gen Z AI. It's from the Center of Technology, Media, and Democracy. So they're focusing in on a specific demographic of users of AI and trying to get their perspective for AI-related legislation. So I think being very specific in terms of what groups you're working with and contextualizing some of the recommendations, changes for deployment and implementation innovation is really useful.
Thanks very much. So Michael?
Yeah, so thanks for this. It's really interesting. Asking less in my academic role and more in my administrative role, I'm curious. So I supervise the Masters of Public Policy program here. I'm curious how much these documents speak to the need for training of public servants or future public servants in these tools. Is internal capacity a major theme in any of these, or and at which levels and in which kinds of agencies?
Across jurisdictions, education and training is a really, really big point of emphasis. I would say, again, from my reading, most emphasized at the federal level. Every policy document for data and AI has a component on internal training and internal capacity and how to bring that up, or how to recruit externally more effectively that expertise. But yeah, that was one of the kind of big qualitative themes that we noticed throughout was education and training.
And some of the advisory councils, I think more recently, like in December and as AI has evolved, have focused on like creating documentations about learning together, responsible AI. And I think those are now being released, but we didn't look at those as part of our initial corpus.
Thank you both. And Ben?
Thanks for the excellent presentation. I'm Ben from Digital Public Square, based in Toronto. I have a question maybe a bit more on the methodological side, although maybe the answers I'm looking for are a little bit more subjective. I'm just curious because you've been really digging into these like semantic ways that these documents are talking about AI in particular, but data as well. If there's any kind of like characteristics you see in terms of what the semantics look like, does it feel like if there's all these different languages of how people talk about AI, there's political language, there's corporate product-y language, there's more academic computer science and more academic social science language that's used. Like, what do these policy documents look like? Does that reflect agenda setting or anything else? Like, how do you see the conversation looking, having really like dug into those things like the use of hallucination versus a different term or whatever else? Thank you.
Kaushar, do you want to go or should I?
Yeah, I can start. So the federal, for sure, there is more of that sort of corporate language that you would expect. It does seem to be less common in municipal. Something else we noticed is that there is a very specific kind of vernacular around sort of the words that are being used. So one example here would be that showed up is the gender-based analysis plus, or GBA plus, which talks about this commitment that the government has made to gender equality, and that's something that appears in these documents. But again, something that seems to be specific there. In that, so there is this sort of corpus of words that's familiar to public service workers in the government. There is a lot, and Ciara can also emphasize on this, but like some of that technical jargon that's less apparent. There's a lot of description around, for example, on the slide we had something about accessible. So it does tend to be in the fact that it's general. It does tend to be something that's been made for workers across different sectors, across all jurisdictions, to be able to access and use the documentation. Ciara, if you want to add to that.
I think you mostly covered it. I guess just the thing I would add is maybe not so much semantic on the word level, but semantic in like the construction of the layout of the documents. To echo Kaushar's point about them being maybe for a more policy-focused audience rather than a technical audience, pretty much everyone includes a glossary defining words like AI and data and things like that. Those definitions tend to be consistent at the jurisdictional level, but again, like fairly plain language, not overly technical. Even when they're discussing, projects that have been implemented, the language is at kind of a layman's level, not a very technical level. I don't know if that answers the question you're asking, but those are some trends that we saw.
Thanks. Yeah, very interesting. Appreciate it.
Are there any other questions from folks? Hearing none, I might just say thank you once again to Kaushar and Ciara for a fantastic presentation and underlying research. Is there a way, what's the plan with the paper and how folks can get access to that?
We're planning to submit hopefully end of this week or sometime soon. But if anyone would like to discuss the results further, see more of the 10 million quantitative results that we outputted, I think, I will have to confirm with the group members, but I'm sure we're happy to share those and talk about those as well. And yeah, the first paper I'll copy and send the link in the chat for the pilot study if anyone wants to look at that.
Wonderful. Yeah, so please feel free to email Ciara or Kaushar if you'd like a copy of the paper. Thank you once again for a fantastic presentation, and have a nice rest of the day, everyone.
Thanks.